Well, for everyone that didn't come and stayed away because of the rain, we have a very special speaker tonight. So you guys get to get the speaker on Zoom and here. So if there's nothing else you want to tell me, we'll move ahead. So Victoria Kastner is our speaker. Victoria was the official historian at Hearst Castle for almost 30 years. In addition to her new biography about its architect, Julian Morgan, an intimate biography of the trailblazing architect, she has also written 3 volumes chronicling its history. Hearst Castle, the biography of a country house, Hearst San Simeon, the gardens and the land, and Hearst Ranch, family land and legacy. Ms. Kastner has a master's degree in public history with a specialty in architectural history from the University of California at Santa Barbara and a master's degree in museum management from George Washington University. She has also published works on the Beverly Hills Hotel. I've heard of that. Bernard Mayfax's Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco and the novels of Charles Dickens. I want to read that. So I don't have a lot more to tell you. Let me just introduce Victoria to you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, really a pleasure. A pleasure to drive from Los Osos. A pleasure to have a rainy night, which has been so long since I had one of those I'd forgotten what it felt like. But especially a pleasure to be among writers, and it is such a solitary activity. And I think in my experience, even writers who are collaborating, I think they're basically going off in a corner and writing and then getting together with someone else who's just been in another corner, you know, and it is such a mixture, I think, with a book of solitude and then society. This is my 43rd event in the last 6 months since the book came out. And of course, it's nothing like any of the others I've done because I've never spoken to writers about writing ever. And so I am thrilled to have an opportunity to do that. And I really hope you'll ask questions and feel free if I don't stop. I've asked Steve to interrupt my steady flow or something if you're on Zoom and I miss what you're saying. But while I'm writing, anyway, what I'm doing is thinking about all the people I'm not with. So I do find it a very solitary activity. And so that takes years. And then a book comes out and there's all of this society, but in a way, that part is like a steady diet of the Snickers bars or something. It's not that it isn't wonderful, but it is frenetic. You know, I mean, it's only been 6 months. What does that mean? That's like 7 events a month. So, but that's because it's been a book tour, and I do feel blessed. I mean, I think certainly my dream, and perhaps yours as well, is to write something that people are interested in, and that is, it is a tremendous blessing. But when this frenzy is done, then presumably, I mean, I did just meet with my editor. And she said, I want to know about your next projects. What are you working on? What are you interested in? You know, and so then the solitude would begin. And I don't know what the ratio is, but it's at least 4 to 1. I mean, you know, maybe more. It takes years to write a book. So what I thought I would do, if this is interesting to you, and as I say, I hope that you'll let me know what is interesting to you, but was talk a little bit about the process of getting published, and then also talk a little bit about my process of writing, which I have honestly never done in a public forum ever. And part of the reason for that is that I am a very unwilling writer. And the, for absolute honesty among a profession, the word that comes to my mind when I sit down at my laptop is 3 letters long, and it is run. So, I mean, and not just run, but run like that. You know, I'm someone who doesn't think, oh, how glorious I'm writing. I'm someone who loves having written. And I think if it were possible to write one book and then do the part I love, which is this part, the social part, I wouldn't have 5 books. The book on the Beverly Hills Hotel, I ghost wrote, but it is, a 400-page book that says it's by, the author with Victoria Kastner. And then I have written book chapters for exhibitions at the De Young Museum on the 1915 World's Fair, and Bernard Maybeck's Palace of Fine Arts, which maybe you know in San Francisco still. They have a beautiful domed rotunda and lagoon from the 1915 fair. And then I wrote a chapter about French porcelain and the collector of French porcelain for an exhibition at the LA County Museum of Art. And then I wrote an article for a British magazine on the novels of Dickens, specifically because I thought, what can I say about Dickens? You know, I adore him, but it was, you know, who doesn't? And I didn't want to just gas on about something that other people had said. But I happen to, as a hobby, I read Dickens novels aloud to myself, if no one else is willing to listen. But anyway, I've read all 14 of them twice aloud, and that's more than 1 million words. And I thought, well, you know, probably not everyone has done that. So I wrote it it was for a law magazine because he was a law clerk in his youth. I wrote an article called Speaking Dickens. So I think what happens to me anyway is I have an itch and it has to get scratched, a thing that I want to say. And then once I have written it in some venue, I'm able to move on. But I'm not probably like all of you. I'm not disciplined about it. I don't write when I don't have a project. I don't write when I don't have a deadline. One will never find me at 9 in the morning with a bunch of sharpened pencils. You know, as a matter of fact, at 9 at night, I will be deciding that really I can't procrastinate any longer. And I often write all night. And it's embarrassing to say that, you know, because I am 67 and you would think that I would have a habit that's less the kind of term paper habit by this point, but really that is what I do. And I have a couple of images that I think about. And one is a tower, a brick tower. And that's how I see myself when I'm writing. As I say, since I do it so unwillingly, and I have this kind of long sort of spooling up thinking process. So I imagine myself walking around and around the cylinder, entirely constructed of brick. And I'm not looking for a window or a door. I'm looking for a crack, some tiny little fissure that will provide me a way in to the subject. And the other thing I think about, because I'm a nonfiction writer and I write illustrated books, and I think that's an important distinction because they really are sort of their own world. So really that's the only world I can share any experience with you with. But the other thing I think about is a bucket. So I think about a bucket and a ladle. And if I'm writing, because I always write nonfiction, how deeply am I going to dip that ladle? Because it all has to come out the same evenness. You know, you can't know a great deal about one era of someone's life or some particular thing and then go all the way down and bring up the best stuff if you're going to have to skim the rest of the surface. So trying to find that balance. And it's odd because, of course, at least as a nonfiction writer, you have to pitch the book and you have to describe the book before you've written the book. And as I understand it with fiction, and as I really don't know anything about fiction, but professionally, I think fiction writers really do have to write the whole thing. And especially they want to know if you can handle dialogue or if your penultimate chapter makes sense or how do you handle the denouement or whatever. So, you know, I see my work as fiction in terms of having a narrative arc, having a story arc. And for this most recent book, which is Julie Morgan, an intimate biography of the trailblazing architect, I pitched a 75,000 word book. And I agented it myself after having had an East Coast agent for a couple of years. And I think for fiction, you really need to have an agent. But for nonfiction, at least illustrated books, all of the books I've written, and here's an example of, they're all about 75,000 words. They have, you know, they're beautiful, but, you know, they have illustrations, but they're also, they have a lot of scholarly rigor. So my endnotes on this volume, this Julie Morgan biography, are 24 pages long. And they took up an additional 22,000 words. So when you consider it's a 75,000 word book, really was a lot. So I'm tied to facts. but especially this being a biography, I set up rules for myself. And the most important rule was that I would never say anything in my narrative that Julia Morgan didn't know at the time it occurred. And if I was ever going to jump forward and say what ultimately happened to one of her buildings in the future or something, that I would do it in parentheses. But otherwise, I would treat it like a novel in the sense that she didn't know what was going to happen next. And so she was always discovering. And so it reads like a novel, and it has a narrative arc. And I'm happy to say it's gotten great reviews in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, the Christian Science Monitor, really wonderful reviews. And it's in its third printing. And that's pretty good for 6 months out. It came out the 1st of March, sorry. And it was sold out, the first in printing, which was 5,000 copies, was sold out by the 10th of March. And that turned out not to be great, because then I had all these book events, and nobody could know that we were going to have a global shipping crisis and all these issues. But anyway, I spent several months of this book tour apologizing to people and signing book plates because there were no books to be had. But anyway, finally they caught up. And so they did another printing of 5,000 copies, and now they're on the third printing of 10,000 copies. So that's 20,000 copies in 6 months. So that is good. I hasten to tell you that it is in no way lucrative, because that's, I think, with illustrated books, if you're going to write them, I think that's an important thing to know. And I mean, there are lots of ways to be enriched. And certainly this aftermath part of meeting people and going wonderful places is very enriching. But there's nothing financially enriching about this. These days, there's so much free content. I paid the photographer who did the most brilliant job, but he spent 2 months traveling up and down California shooting Julia Morgan buildings. There's 150 images in here. And I had to promise all of them. I had to vouch, for all of them. And what he didn't take, I had to buy. There are stock houses, and licensing agreements that you have to do with libraries, or sometimes with big companies like Alamy. And they charge a lot of money. And especially, you make a contract with them, and then you go back and tell them there's another printing. Well, you have to pay again. And not the same amount, because they've got you by the short hairs. They know, I mean, the book's already out. What are they going to do? So you have to keep paying. And and I have a research assistant, because this involves so much groundbreaking scholarship. Julia Morgan, for those of you who don't know, was the architect who built not only Hearst Castle, but 700 buildings, of which San Simeon was her 503rd structure. And when she started it, she couldn't vote in a presidential election, speaking of a pertinent night, since it is election night. So, and she was 47 in 1919. So she really was remarkable for that. But even though I had studied her literally for decades, with this research assistant, there were many things that we discovered about her life that I hadn't known after writing 3 books about her. And her life was harder. It was full of more adversity and more challenges, more personal challenges than I'd ever realized. So it felt like it was an extremely important book to write. And I felt like I was really the only person who could write it, because I'd worked at Hearst Castle, which is its own, it is a castle in kind of the fortified sense. I mean, if you're not working there, it's very difficult to get access to its material. The myth about Julia Morgan is that she burned her papers and that we'll never know anything about her private life. But actually, she saved tens of thousands of pages of material, and it all happens to be at Cal Poly, nearly all, in special collections of the Kennedy Library. So that is a miracle. But anyway, even though I've been working with that material since 1985, when I was taking an electric typewriter up 4 flights of steps to transcribe things, there was so much in there that I didn't know. So I started my research assistant working on it in 2017, because she has to work ahead of me. So, and I've worked with her on every book since my second volume, which is this one on the Gardens of San Simeon. These castle books I did as a work for hire. It was part of my job, and they made quite a bit of money, but certainly not to me. But raised money for the castle. The royalties and the honoraria went to the nonprofit group. But anyway, so working without her is completely unthinkable. So she started in 2017, and then in 2018, I left the castle. I retired, which I was fortunate to be able to do as a state employee, so that I could work on this full time. I hadn't pitched it. I didn't know if anybody was going to publish it. You know, I didn't have an agent. I don't have anything in 2018, but I knew I needed time, you know, to try to do it. So I got an agent, and uh, that process I thought might be of interest to you by writing a query letter. And I don't think that's very different when you're pitching fiction or nonfiction or illustrated books or unillustrated books. If you're interested in query letters, I think the person who has got the soundest advice that bears out my experience is Jane Friedman, F-R-E-I-E-D-M-A-N, Jane Friedman. She has been in the book world for her entire career, and she has really, and she's always revising it. Like, I just went online to make sure she's still doing this, and the stuff she's posting is in October of 2022. And so she really has her finger on the pulse of the publishing industry, and I would recommend, and it's free, of course, everything she says is free. And so I would highly recommend her as somebody to kind of give you the inside skinny. But the other thing I would say is that when I started, I'd never published anything. When I started at, writing this book as part of my job at Hearst Castle, I didn't know anything about how to do that. And one of the first things I did was subscribe to the industry magazine, which is still the industry magazine. And it's called Published Weekly. And for about the first 6 months, I could have, read it upside down. Well, it's right. I mean, it didn't make any sense to me at all. But it was, this is a business. And it was important, I thought, to figure out what's happening in the business to understand it. And I had at that time, this is the 90s, but I had a book called How to Get Happily Published by Jane Applebaum. And it was very much the kind of how to succeed in business without really trying kind of book. If you ever saw that film with Robert Morris disappearing into a closet and then reading the next chapter, very much that way. And, it would be out of date now. I think the last edition was probably published in 97, which is when I was doing this. But I do think it's really important to understand the business aspects of this, and if you stick with it, you really can sort of understand. So anyway, I wrote query letters, and I got the contracts. I agented these 3 books, and they were all published. The trilogy set on the castle. They were all published by Abrams, and at the time, Abrams was the greatest art book publisher in the world. And I also think it might be relevant because this is a field made up of, of human beings. And I have to say, some of the finest, kindest, most delightful human beings I have ever met. And so maybe to know how to do that, I had, in the 90s, in 97, I had written a book that was called How to Be Your Own Literary Agent. And it was by a man named Martin Levin. He'd been the head of Time Life Corporation, and he was forced to retire at 60 from publishing. And so he went to law school, and he became a really important literary attorney in his later years. He just died a few years ago. But anyway, I had read this, and at the end of his book, he said, my son isn't publishing, my wife isn't publishing, and now you've read this book, and I feel like you're part of my publishing family. And I had a question that I wanted to ask him. And this was in the 90s. It's different now, but in a way, I think it's easier now to get a hold of really anyone. There's so many ways to get a hold of people now. But I thought, well, I'm on the West Coast, and he's on the East Coast. And it's 4 here, and he might be working late, and I'm going to call his office. And I did. And he picked up the phone. His secretary had gone home, but he was still there. And I had bought the book and read the book, his book. And I had a question, and it was a legitimate question. I can't even remember what it was. But I said something about, I'm on the second to the last page, and I have a question about your book. And he said, well, I'm going to hang on here till you finish it. And we just instantly went into this lovely rapport, and what he said was, well, you need to get in touch with Paul Gottlieb. And Paul Gottlieb was the CEO and editor-in-chief of Abrams at that time. And he'd happened to work for Martin at Time Life. And so, we had this just completely delightful conversation. Martin ended up being my literary attorney, on behalf of Hearst Castle, because it was a work for Harvard still. He did the work, and I ended up meeting him, and we became dear friends. But people in publishing are really nice. It's a lot about a couple of things, I think, in terms of meeting them. One, you have to do your work. You have to have read their things, because of course they're constantly. It must be like being a physician, who's constantly, being cornered literally by somebody who's worried about their sciatica or something, at a cocktail party. And so they have a sort of a natural, about kind of being importuned. But if you have a legitimate question, and if you really have already done the work, then they're very interested, And so what he said was, well, you have to get in touch with Paul Gottlieb. And by then I'd written query letters, and I'd gotten a couple of rejections. I thought, well, surely Chronicle Books, that West Coast publisher that ended up publishing this through the Morgan book, surely they're going to be interested, and so would UC Press. I mean, it's her alma mater, and well, I got complete rejection letters from them. And then Rizzoli, whom I'd also written to, and this was after 6 or 8 months of reading Publisher Weekly, they said, well, we'll publish something, but it's going to be like a little chunky book. I mean, really, like this big and thick. And I was like, it was going to have 5,000 words. In other words, it's like not even worth it. So, but anyway, I had saved Abrams. So anyway, I was able, after talking to Martin Levin, I didn't write to the submissions editor. I wrote straight to the CEO. And the first line of my query letter was, Martin Levin recommended that I write to you about publishing opportunities at Hearst Castle. And within 2 weeks, he was at the Beverly Hills Hotel, which is the pink one on Sunset, which I never dreamed I'd be writing a whole book about later. But anyway, he was there, and he came up in a limo from there, and he came to the castle and spent a day with me. And then he became a really dear friend. And I sent white chocolate cheesecakes to his for his birthday for a year, and was at his service when he died. He died sadly of a heart attack some years ago. And I knew his wife and his nephew and his son, and so they're really nice. But you have to do the work. And the other thing that I think happens in publishing is that authors will write to people, whether it's agents. Everybody specializes, but if it's an agent who specializes in science fiction gets a query letter about a romance novel or about a mathematical work of nonfiction on the wonder of mathematics or something. I mean, that happens to them a lot. And in a way, it's a benefit, because if you don't do those things, if you actually have read and you've gone to people's acknowledgments, and you've either bought a lot of books or you've spent a lot of time in the library, and you've gone through the acknowledgments and seen specific authors who have credited these specific people to whom you are writing, and you have reason for legitimate questions or whatever, they will answer, and you will really stand out, because as I say, most people don't do that. So anyway, that was how that all began. And then, but for this book, I was first thinking, when I started query letters, that I would try to do like a conventional biography, which would be, just think of any of David McCullough's books or Doris Kearns Goodwin's or something. Big, her life is not as inscrutable as people thought, but nevertheless, it's not so well documented. It would always be sort of small, but it would have 2 signatures of black and white photographs or something, Well, so even then, so I got an agent by, I was at a book festival with another author, and I was signing at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. Her name is Beth Macy. Maybe you know her. She's just done Dope Sick with Michael Keaton, and let's see what she did before that, Factory Man. Anyway, she writes nonfiction, a kind of reportorial books. And so I was signing with her at the end of this festival, and authors very seldom meet each other because they're always alone. And so she said, oh, you should just go to my agent. And so anyway, I wrote the query letter to her agent, who was at that time at Foundry Media. And he said that he would represent me, and he did. Now, that if he had been able to sell it, which he wasn't, it would mean that he would take 15% of all of my earnings from then on for on anything related to this book. But he tried, but what he helped me do is work on the book proposal, which was extensive, and we did multiple drafts of it. And I think that really, these are jobs that editors used to do, but agents do it now, because editors have so little time, because the sky is always full in the book industry. And it really is true. It's not a big margin business. But the pressure has definitely increased with all of these conglomerates and, all these mergers that are happening throughout, especially in the last 10 years. So anyway, the work that editors used to do, agents now do. So he represented me, and I needed that time, and because I had to write this book, and Valentine was interested for about a second and a half, but then they weren't interested anymore, and because she didn't build anything west of the Mississippi. I mean, so east of the Mississippi. So I thought, well, okay, I'll agent it myself, which is what I had done before. And I wrote a one-page query letter to 3 West Coast publishers. And I heard back from all of them within 24 hours. And but I had known I could do that. I just thought, well, I'm going to try to sit at the big kids table here. And as it turned out, I was so lucky. Since I don't have an agent, I hired a literary attorney to negotiate the contract. This is the first book that I, have done that is just for me, royalties such as they are, certainly all come to me. So I asked for a couple of things in the negotiations. One, I wanted a 240-page book instead of a 220. And 2, I wanted my endnotes not to be counted in the word total. And 3, I wanted a heavy coated paper, not a matte paper. And they said no to all of those things. Chronicle did. But I liked them better than I liked the other 2 publishing houses. So I went with Chronicle. And the great thing is, and this isn't always the case, but I had such a marvelous team. I have this brilliant photographer, this exceptional research assistant, and then, as it turned out, a fabulous book designer and an editor. And often group projects don't have everybody working at the same high, dedicated level. But this case, we all felt, well, she was so remarkable, we're going to swing for the fences. Anyway, in the middle, they didn't tell me this, but suddenly I saw that my 220-page book had become a 240-page book. And that my endnotes, which they had refused to, they were going to count. I was going to lop off, a quarter or a third of my content text to do these endnotes. And I needed them to be that specific, because people would think I'm making this stuff up otherwise, because they think she burned all her papers. She exchanged 2,462 letters just with William Randolph Hearst that are all at Cal Poly. To say nothing of she saved diaries, all her mother's correspondence. So there is a tremendous amount of material that had never been used or documented. So anyway, so suddenly they printed every 22,000 words of endnotes without changing a comma, without cutting anything. And instead of having, in the beginning, they said, well, yes, it would be nice to have coded pages if this were, kind of like a coffee table book. But this is not a coffee table book. It's a really, it's a beautiful text, and we don't want the images to detract from your words. Well, next thing I knew, they had chosen I'll just pass this around, but they had chosen the most exquisite coated paper that I'd never experienced. And they didn't say anything, but I mean, they were a dream, an absolute dream. So that turned out to be, a very fortunate situation. But the odd thing about writing at least nonfiction books, and as I say, illustrated books, is that before you've written it, they want you to say what it's going to be. I had to pitch it. I had to say what it was. I had to give them the in the proposal that came after the query. The query is 1 page, super punchy, and really what I think of it as is it's kind of like an application for a non-collateralized loan, because you're really asking somebody to give you several $1,000s, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, to take a chance. And so it really has to have a business aspect to it. You have to say, why am I the person to write this? Who's the market? Who's the audience for it? Where would it go? Is there competition? And if there isn't competition, why? I mean, sometimes they don't want you to write about something that no one else has written about. It's like, well, why? If no one else has written about it, maybe it's no good to write about, that sort of thing. And they wanted to know any tie-ins, and dumb luck, but it happened to be this year is her 150th, her sesquicentennial. But anyway, tie-ins are important, anything like that. But you're basically asking for a loan, an unsecured loan. So once the query comes out, then they want to see a couple of sample chapters. They want the outline, which is going to be all, a summary of each of the chapters. And you have to say the trim size for an illustrated book, you have to tell them. You're thinking, well, wouldn't they know this better than I know this, you know? But you have to tell them. I had to say that I wanted a book that was the size of my other ones. But I would say a 9 by 12 book, or in this case, an 8 by 10 book with 240, and they knocked it down to 220 pages and 75,000 words and 150 illustrations. And, you know, you have to point all that out. You have to have an elevator pitch, really, like the one sentence, you know, the first book to tell the story of the private life of the world's greatest female architect, that sort of thing. So it really is all about, it's a business. And, but even while I'm doing all this, I haven't written it, you know, and so that's what's so odd. Maybe if you're a fiction writer, it makes more sense because at least you've written the thing that you're trying to sell. But they, you know, with nonfiction, they know how it's going to end. So it's not, it doesn't have the same sort of cliffhanger quality. But they really want to know, why are you the person? What insider knowledge do you have? And also these days, the big term is an author platform. And what that really means, unfortunately, in my opinion, but is social media. And because I only write books in order to speak about them, because that's what I truly love. I had an extensive experience lecturing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and being on the Today Show and CBS This Morning and CBS Sunday Morning and all kinds of things like that. So I'm able to list all those things, but they want to know what is the level of specific expertise that makes you the person to write X, you know? And because it is true, I believe, I've read recently that 97% of all books that are published don't earn out, meaning don't make back the advance that the authors are given to write them. Now, when I did my first book on the castle, the biography of the country house, I got a foreword from George Plimpton, because I was with Paul Gottlieb and we became friends. And he said, well, now who would you like to write this foreword? And I thought about it. I thought maybe Alistair Cook, or his Hearst was a media mogul, you know, or Walter Cronkite, or George Plimpton. And of those three, George Plimpton was, you know, I mean, he was the participatory journalist. He was an East Coast Brahmin, but he also, you know, joined the football teams, or played cymbals in the Chicago Symphony, or, you know, he did all those things. So anyway, Paul said to me, oh, well, that's great. I'm having lunch with him next week. I'll ask him. So like, that was like amazing. And as it turned out, it was one of the last things he wrote before his death, very sadly. So anyway, because I had that inside track, I was able to do that. But the important thing is, do you have followers? And you know, they wanted to know my Twitter handle. Oh, I cannot tell you how horrifying. But anyway, since I was a state employee, I was representing the castle by their consent. And so castle has really good numbers. Like, of course, it's been closed for a long time and all of those things. But I mean, 650,000 visitors a year. And those are numbers that get people's attention, because every one of those people is going to walk through that gift shop at the visitor center. So, and yet there'd never been a book, a serious book. And so people thought that Citizen Kane was the first, last, and only thing to be said about Hearst Castle. So, you know, in terms of finding a topic, I'm not exactly sure what to say. The other topic that I'm writing about right now, and really more thinking that I ought to be writing about, but I actually have written one draft, is Fred Astaire. And I'm writing about Fred Astaire's time in London, because there's an anniversary coming up, which is the centennial of his debut on the West End on London Theatre, which was in March of 1923. So I went to London to do some research, and his papers are at Boston University, and I've gone there. And my theory is that this article is going to be taken by a British publication, I hope, because he spent the 10 years that he spent in London. When he was in London more than America, he's from Nebraska, he's from Omaha, but he was in London more than America during the entire decade of the 1920s. And he was dancing with his sister, Adele, who was the star, and he was the, you know, the backup person. And he had one of the longest careers in show business, from age 4 to age 81. But anyway, I think that if I tell a British audience that an American icon is exactly who he is because of them, I think that is a cannot lose scenario. But I don't know that, because I gave Julia Morgan this 6 months, you know, but now it's definitely time to bestir myself. I went to the London Library. I looked at where am I going to try to pitch this? I mean, I have a couple of publication credits. I did a little thing for the London Telegraph. And then I told you about this London Law magazine, but I mean, really not very much. So I don't know. I don't know if anybody's going to want it, but I have to get like right on it because I'm going to have to, what I'm thinking now is I'll pitch it in January, which is still 2 months ahead. And I think it is a long form like magazine or newspaper article. I mean, we'll see. But anyway, I'm not sure. I can't talk to you about how to choose a subject because I mean, I think of J.K. Rowling and the wand chooses the wizard. I have these obsessions that I mean, it's just, you know, you don't choose to fall in love. I mean, I've fallen in love with certain subjects. I become quite insufferable about them, as a matter of fact, but I'm not rationally choosing them. But then again, I will say this. I used to go to the advanced placement classes at Morley High every year and talk to the students. And one of the things that in the English department, but one of the things I would say to them is if everyone is studying World War II, study World War I. And I do think that that is very important. And so even though one can't really choose everything about how you pick a subject, I mean, it just takes one incredibly charismatic professor, and suddenly you've got 30 or 40 little disciples who are all studying 18th century French furniture. And you know, then the competition just becomes terrible. You better be good, or you're going to be talking about the cabriole leg on one side of a piece of French furniture. You know what I mean? Because the market gets saturated really early. So I would say that the important thing is to go where people aren't. But even still, I mean, you can create a scenario like that for nonfiction work. But I didn't think I'm now going to write about Fred Astaire. You know, I mean, I watched one of his films again, and at a sad time in my life, was so incredibly gobsmacked, dove deep, and got as obsessed with that as I have been with Saint-Simeon. So I don't know. I can't really respond to how, you know, how to pick something. But I do think it's important to try. I mean, you have to write about you and what you know, because everything is really always about ourselves. But I do think that you can sort of, I don't know what to say, salt the pot by putting yourself where the people already aren't. Because the thing that people in publishing hear all the time is a spin-off on, you know, a girl wizard who goes to an American school and finds out that she's a wizard at the age of 11 or whatever. I mean, it's not always that unoriginal, but a lot of times it is. And so you've got to find that one piece of land that you have passion for, where a whole army of other enthusiasts are not currently standing. And I'm, you know, I'm aware, as every writer needs to be, of time. And so the things I wanted to say about writing are, I don't have a lot to say, except that I spend as much time, I'd say, reading aloud my work as I do writing. And I'm always thinking about the rhythm, the cadences of my words. That the third book I did of this trilogy, which really is kind of a volume one, because it's 150 years. It's the entire time of the Hearst family and the Hearst Ranch. So I did it last, but it really belongs first in the trilogy. But anyway, it's called Hearst Ranch Family, Land, and Legacy. And I thought a long time, you know, about that title, and I would never call it Family and Legacy, because that's too redundant, and I wanted to call it family, land, and legacy, you know, something that has that rhythm. I think about the rhythm. I think about the flow. I think a lot about what I have heard called the bus plunge problem, which is that we tend to have these portmanteau words, these combinations of words that just get, I mean, buses in a newspaper article, if there's some kind of a crash, they plunge. They don't fall, they don't plummet, they plunge. They always plunge. And so there's just a verb that goes with that noun. And so to try to get so it's not really a cliche so much as it is a habit, but to get that bus plunge, all of those bus plunge combinations out. So in a way, for me, writing is like find a word, because I'm constantly at the thesaurus, but it has to flow. It's got to sound like my choice of a word. It's got to be the meaning that I want the word to express. It can't just be something I've chosen arbitrarily, it has to exactly express my sentiment. So that's, I think, an important part of writing, but reading aloud is hugely, hugely important to me. The other thing is that I think what I try to do is have each sentence that I write, and again, I'm not making things up. I have to tell the story as it. I'm selective about what I can choose to highlight, but I mean, my fealty is to the truth and to fact as we know it. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean it's not a narrative. But I try to make each sentence follow each succeeding sentence. I try to make the end of every paragraph follow the opening of the next paragraph. And I try to make the end of every chapter ineluctably follow, where you just have to keep turning the page, the next chapter. And I would say that, so that's about transitions. That's about understanding the linkages between thoughts and ideas and not jumping, making sure that it's logical and what I mean to say told in an original way, with a sense of suspense, because it is a story, even if it is nonfiction, but keeps you turning the page. And I would say that the best for nonfiction, the book that I have gone to over and over again, is called The Modern Researcher, and it's by Jacques Barzun, Barzun. And I think the last edition came out in the 90s. I mean, it was the 5th edition. Every 7 years they brought it out. And in the first edition, they were discussing ballpoint pens, But it's a book about research, but really it's a book about writing and then speaking about writing after. I mean, he is such a genius. His words are so profound. So for nonfiction writing, I would recommend he wrote it, co-authored it with Henry Graff, and they were at Columbia University. And sadly, he's gone now. But I think he had the chair of the history of ideas or something at Columbia. I do think it's important to have some kind of a manual in a sense to follow, but mostly what I do is I try to answer the reader's unasked questions. And I write to an individual person, and it's not someone I know. I find an ideal reader. I mean, I had a French tutor, and I wrote to his wife, not his wife, his Aunt Leora in Boscobel, Wisconsin. And I never met her, but I knew that she was an intelligent woman who would not know a lot about the subject, but would have a lot of interest. But anyway, when I'm writing, I am absolutely writing to a person. But I'm fortunate because I have a subject that is, has some sizzle. It's got Hearst, it's got Marion Davies, it's got Susan Cain, it's got Hollywood, it's got this sizzle. But also, after all of these years, I know what people are going to ask because I've done literally hundreds and perhaps even more than maybe even 1,000 different lectures, enormous numbers. So I can answer their unasked questions. But when I give a talk, that's what I'm trying to do. And this is, as I say, new ground for me because I'm usually using images and telling a narrative arc, and instead of actually standing up here in a confessional sense. But when the other thing I think about when I write, besides how I don't want to be writing, the other thing I think about is all of the people around the world who are having a similar struggle at that very moment. However it manifests itself, because as I say, it's a solitary thing to do. When writers get together, and I just was fortunate enough to speak at the Sonoma Authors Festival with Amor Tolles and Dave Barry and Bill Browder and Nikki Ehrlich. And Nikki Ehrlich just she was a laid off travel writer during the pandemic in New York who wrote The Measure. It came out in July, and she's 27. And it's a wonderful premise. It's about everyone in the world getting one morning a box on their doorstep, and inside, it was about the Greek myth about the women who spin time. Inside was a string that told you how long you were going to live. And everyone had to decide if they were going to look at it or not look at it, and all of the ramifications that happened from that. Of course, political parties, the non-string, the string, pro-string, So she spun it out as kind of a little bit science fiction, a little bit cautionary tale, just a novel. And of course, it came out it was set in March, not before March of 2020. I think a lot of it's timing, But anyway, it was instantly picked by Jenna Bush Hager as her July book of 2022. It's already been translated into 12 different languages. She's 27. So it is possible. She's very good, but it is possible. and maybe in a way more possible as a writer than it would be, say, to be like a concert pianist or an athlete or something, where you really literally have to put in so much time. You have to be good. I don't think writing in a long way, in a true way, can really be taught. I don't think. I mean, I think you can maybe be a better version of who you are, but I don't think that you can really learn, how to write, except just what is inside you, because we're all our own word factory, and I don't think you can ever, if you try to be someone else's word factory, then I think it just doesn't work. It's not genuine. But anyway, so I mean, she was intelligent. She thought about these things. She was very thoughtful, but this book grabbed the zeitgeist. And so I was, as I say, I was signing books and consorting with all these really famous and very exciting, Eric Larson, who did The Devil in the White City. I mean, it's fascinating. And just to meet authors is such a thrill. But talking to her, she was like, but in a way, the thing to end on, because I see I've got like 5 minutes, but
Got as much time.
oh, well, thank you so much, Janice. In a way, I think maybe this is a good, maybe start by telling you the bad news. As I said, this will never be remunerative. The amount of money that I have spent, I will never get to zero on this book. I mean, I've spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, I give my research assistant a very large chunk of my pension every single month, and I couldn't do things without her. And so it's necessary. But because illustrated books are so expensive to put together, and I mean, this is a gorgeous book, exquisite. I wouldn't change a thing about it. I'm so thrilled. But the money all goes up front into it. And so with regular books, you probably know this, there's an advance, and those have been lowering. My first advance is, I didn't keep it, but it was $20,000 to do the Hearst, Castle Biography of a Country House book. This one that I got from Chronicle was a $10,000 advance, but it's not a gift. You have to earn it back. So it's not like a big advance, it's not necessary unless you're, the Obamas or something who are going to get millions. It's really not important to have a big advance, but with regular book sales, the way it usually goes is that once you get back to zero, which is called earning out the advance, that 97% of all books don't do. But if you sell enough copies to get to zero, then the first 10,000 copies, you make 10% on the cover price, or 12, whatever you negotiate, something like that. And then the next 5,000 copies, you make 15%. And then once you get up to 20,000 copies, you make 20% of the cover price. Now, the cover price of this book is $32.50. And if it were just ink on pieces of paper, that's what I would be getting. Maybe $6 a book, maybe $5.80 a book, something like that. But because the money is astronomical to put this together, and the printing and all of the printing costs, etc. What illustrated books get, I get 6%, 32.50, and that's after earning out the advance, and it doesn't go up. It's 6%, and it's not really 6% because I've been getting royalty statements from these books all my whole career since the first one came out in 2000. So as I said, they've made a lot of money, but you make it really slowly, and I will never get to zero, because if it's sold on Amazon, you don't get 6%, you get 3%, and every bookseller they withhold 20% of whatever is printed, because booksellers can send it back if it doesn't sell. So so it's not 6%. So instead of getting even 6%, I am getting about $1.10 a copy when I earn out the advance, which I have not even yet. And coming to 20,000 copies, maybe I will have, but that $10,000 advance I got. So that's the bad news. I mean, don't think this is a great way to make a living unless you have another means. I'm not a wealthy person, but it's been important to me to do this, and because I have a pension, I'm able to do it. But there's no money in illustrated books. I mean, that's just a given. But the good side of that is that I believe, and this is a way to kind of wind up, and I'd love to take questions if you have any, but I believe that books have an outsized influence on the culture now. Because if we look at numbers, social media numbers, TikTok, and I mean, whatever, they're astronomical social media numbers. My little 10 or 20,000 copies is nothing when you look at these people and the followers on Twitter and all these things. But on the bright side, I think that even though not many people read books or even buy books, I think that the people who do have a high respect for books, and that people don't have to either read them or buy them to still respect them. And therefore, I think they can have an extremely, a disproportionate influence on the culture. And people don't need to read them to be affected by them. And so that's the good side of what is not particularly remunerative. I don't know if I could ever write a book that was just ink on pieces of paper. I don't see myself as a fiction writer doing dialogue, and so I don't see this ever becoming lucrative. But as a labor of love goes, you know, it's been more than worth it. And we ended up transcribing 800,000 words at Cal Poly that are either from or to Julia Morgan. And for somebody who's supposed to burn everything that she ever had, it's a pretty impressive amount. And what we're doing right now is, and of course that means it's now in a Word document, it's Word searchable. And Ruth, my research assistant, and I, we are proofing it. And Cal Poly has said they're going to put it online. And they're digitizing the letters, but Julia Morgan had atrocious handwriting and highly imaginative spelling, and tended to use a lot of foreign terms. And even also, like Hearst Castle is such an inside baseball sort of subject. They would use the word tower to mean 5 different things, depending, they knew what it meant, but depending on what they were building at the time that they said it. You know, I mean, so you'd have to, so these transcriptions are going to say, in 1932, the tower alluded to the celestial suite on the south side because of blah, 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 blah. So it's an annotated version of her, not everything. I mean, there's some stuff at the Bancroft, but nearly the entire corpus of her career. And they're going to post it, Word searchable, next to each digitized letter. And we're figuring out the logistics of that. I hope it'll be within the year. I can't, you know, ever erect a bronze statue to someone I admire incredibly, but to me, this is more than just a task or a hobby or a topic. It's a mission. Her life was so remarkable. Her constraints were so difficult. The way she triumphed over them was so admirable. This is a time when we need to be inspired by people who weren't limited by circumstance in their lives. And it's an inspiring story to tell when we desperately need them. And that has been a great privilege. And to make sure that anywhere in the world, scholars are going to be studying her, able to study her. That's the really important thing. And so in a way, there are a few things more satisfying. So it's not about profit, you know, it's about joy. And even if all the joy comes at the end, because really it didn't come during the thing. I felt like I'd been sentenced to I'd done some horrible crime that I wasn't aware of. I was having to write all this stuff because it was so hard for me. But anyway, here it is. And there's something so wonderful about holding a book in your hand and realizing that even now, I don't know if there's a more pure or more brilliant technology or anything that can confer the same kind of joy and greatness. So these are all words I've never uttered to anyone but you. And I'm thrilled to have had a chance to do it. And so thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes, Harvey.
I want to comment on what you talked about when you were talking about the writing process.
Mm-hmm.
And you're paying attention to cadence and transitions, etc., and choosing words that exactly fit what you want to say. That applies to nonfiction and fiction.
I'm sure it does.
It's the same thing. And I say that as a person, I've written 23 books, half of them are fiction, half of them are nonfiction. So I can tell you it's the same art. It's just put to a different purpose.
Well, because you're always thinking of the reader and what they are going to, you know, I think a book is, the words are in service to a reader. And the other reason, you know, the other reason to do this is I never wanted to be an academic. I have 2 master's degrees and I certainly have been a part of that world, but I don't want to write about that world or participate in anything that's about arcane, you know, calls for papers. And I mean, it's great for other people who want to do that, but I didn't want to do that. I want to tell stories. And furthermore, with writing about, you know, Dickens or Astaire or Bernard Maybeck or Julia Morgan, somebody's going to have to write about Stalin, but it's not going to be me. And I only want to write about people who are better than I am, who are inspiring to me. And I want to have that fervor of telling and sharing. Really, it's not telling, it's sharing their story. And so another great thing is that as a writer, you get to choose. I mean, you know, you are all the CEO of whatever your name is. Mine, I'm CEO of Victoria Kastner, you know, but you're all the CEOs, and only you have had the experiences you've had. And I think you had another question.
Yeah, Julia Morgan is made, here, every once in a while, Hearst Castle and stuff. I mean, she's not unknown, but she hasn't been known.
That's right.
So your work's not known. So my question is, should she be put on a U.S. Postal Service?
Well, we've already looked into that, and I do think she should absolutely be, you know, and it's a great thing when you can find a subject where there is familiarity. People are familiar with her name, but they don't know very much about her, and most of what they know is incorrect. And you can't always, I mean, I don't know that you can manufacture that scenario, but that's a great scenario, you know, because then people have a ready interest. They and they also have preconceptions, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know. It's much better than if they don't neither know nor care. But when I have new things to say, and as I said, because I had Ruth, and she's so brilliant as a researcher. And these days, you know, you really, I mean, I'm an okay researcher, but I think you need an intuition, and that's where Doc Barton talks about this, to know where something is going to be. He said to be a writer of nonfiction, you have to have imagination. Doesn't mean you're going to make stuff up. It means you got to figure out where it would be if you went there. How are you going to find? And I mean, it's also full of very easy advice that is invaluable, like never write on the backside of a piece of paper, ever. And you know, because you'll just be pawing through things and never find them. And I find other ways to conserve, but I only write on the front of a piece of paper for files. So I mean, it's full of just the most workaday things and the most elevated things about fact and versus ideas, and he's full of inspiration. But anyway, we couldn't find the death certificate for Julia's eldest brother. She had terrible family crises, and as I say, I didn't know how bad they were. And these days, another thing about doing research is that newspapers.com, in the beginning, when they were doing optical scanning, it wasn't that good for all the fonts. You'd read long, and then suddenly stuff would start looking like noodles in Greek or Sanskrit or something. But now they have scanned so many newspapers, it is possible, unlike before, when you really had to go to a great academic library to get access to these things. You can sit in your room and have the world. You have to subscribe, but threefold, ancestry.com, newspapers.com, britishnewspapers.com. I mean, I have to pay subscriptions and all those things, but they bring the world, you know. But anyway, those have been absolutely invaluable. Well, we knew he had died in 1918, his eldest brother, and we couldn't find his death certificate. And the we in this case definitely means Ruth, not I. And she went to all the conventional places, and finally, I'm not sure how she did it, but clearly it had been moved. And when she found it, he had died of cerebral spinal lose, which is another word for neurosyphilis. Wow. He died of syphilis, and it was in 1918. So we thought, well, it must have been the flu, and there were so many people dying, and we just, you know, I wasn't going to say that because I couldn't say anything. But when we found out that he had died of syphilis and that Julia's was the name on his death certificate, even though he had a wife, a daughter, 3 living siblings, and 2 living parents, it was as if it had happened to us. I mean, it was immobilizing. It was so incredibly upsetting because the opprobrium of that. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's a shameful tragedy in 1918. And I couldn't figure out what she was doing in Pasadena. We had these interviews, and someone had said, oh, she worked so hard and she'd be gone weeks at a time in Pasadena. And I'm thinking, doing what? She did the YWCA there in 1923. What's she doing? Well, that's what she was doing. He was in a sanitarium in Pasadena. She was helping him die in a way that is very much like the late phases of dementia. Terrible, terrible. And that's just one thing that I didn't know. I mean, there were so many things. So even when you think you know a subject, these days, with the amount of information that's available at our fingertips, there's never been a better time, certainly, to be a nonfiction author than now. It is, of course, but you got to be that bloodhound, you know, or hire her or him. Bruce says to me, well, anybody could do this. And I say, really? Well, then why hasn't anyone done it but you, you know? So that's impressive. And I know I'm mindful of time. Any other questions that anyone in the Zoom audience wants to ask, maybe?
Yeah, I have one from Zoom. I have a Zoom. Can you
Mhm.
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I just want to say thank you so much. You were
my
so
pleasure.
informative, so inspiring.
Thank you.
I can't thank you for all the good and honest stuff you've given us. So have a great day, but thank you so much for being here.
Well, how kind of you.
Great.
Thank you. It's a lonely life, I think,
Uh-huh.
but that's why we're part of a fraternity, even if we don't always meet. Anyone else?
And I have a question. I'm also on Zoom.
Mhm.
I second the thank you so much for everything that you've told us. Could you please tell me again the name of the book that was written by Jacques Barzun, or if I'm pronouncing it
It's
correctly?
Barzun, and I went hunting for it before I got here, and I couldn't find it quickly. It's called The Modern Researcher. It's out of print currently.
Okay.
You can get it on ABE,
What is ABE?
Advanced Book Exchange, and it's a
Thank you.
clearinghouse for used bookstores.
Oh, okay.
Well, good luck. It's worth it. What you're doing is important. It's worth it. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Have a
Thank
lovely
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I really enjoyed that. I had no idea so much work went into illustrated books. So much thanks to everyone, and next time I'll see you here.